So, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers. I mean, it's an excellent project. This E4A project is very good to link the economic and the legal scholars on this issue. Thanks to Peter, who has been coordinating that. And actually, thanks a lot for. I think when we are at the conference and we start by talking about Thomas Berry words, I think it's a very good start. So I'm very happy about that. And as on myself, I mean, I've been involved in environmental law and sustainability issues for a long time from a legal point of view. A few years ago, I founded and I co-direct a research group which is called Regulation for Sustainability, and the aim was to bring together people from different disciplines. So we are mostly lawyers and economists, but now we are expanding to link also with other scholars, and we have a few research projects. And I'm also vice chair of the Ecological Law and Governance Association that Klaus just mentioned. I will say some, according to what we decided with Jeff, I will say something more about this launch event that Klaus mentioned tomorrow before the final session. So I will tell you more about that, about the possible links also with the E4A project. For the moment, I think it's time to move on, and I will give you my understanding of what are the failures, in my opinion, of environmental law, and how we should promote a shift to ecological law. This is part of the research I've been doing in the last few years. So, okay, will you move? Okay, next. Okay, over the last 40 years, environmental law has evolved, in my opinion, along through two main phases, which correspond to two trends, sometimes working in parallel, sometimes conceptually opposing the one to the other. Let's move on. What I call the regulatory trend and what I call the deregulatory trend. We can see that happening in most jurisdictions around the world. So let's move on next to what are the features of the regulatory trend. The regulatory trend has been characterized by an attempt to protect the environment through the adoption of legislation aimed at managing negative environmental externalities of economic activities. So it's mostly the law related and building upon a given economic underpinning paradigm. I think there are major criticalities with this approach, which is still the most recurrent one in most jurisdictions. First of all, it's very often an emergency response approach. Environmental law is often conceived as fixing the problems. When the problem arises, we create or we restructure environmental law, but we never look, or we normally don't look at the whole picture. In fact, there is a lack of medium long-term vision, and there is an uncontested support of the mainstream economic model, which, as you know, is based on infinite growth paradigm on a finite planet. This is the mainstream, and the mainstream is generally given for granted. And so there are examples, of course, in my research being based in Europe. I've been mostly looking at the European Union legislation, but I think as far as I could see that the situation is very similar in different countries. And for example, a good example of this regulatory approach is what in Europe is called ambient air quality legislation. So not the single sources of pollution, but the general quality of the air. This is a good area where you have excellent legislation, but still you don't achieve results. I mean, in Europe, everybody says the European legislation is perfect. I've been working with Chinese officials. They say, oh, we just, we decided European legislation is the best example, so we copied this legislation as our model for Chinese law. But I mean, if you look at the air quality in Europe, in big cities, it's very bad. So this means there is something wrong with the old concept of this. And so I think there is a sort of environmental regulation paradox where the more you regulate, the worse is getting the environmental quality in many situations. So there must be something wrong in the making of the law, not very much in the implementation. Most of the lawyers nowadays, particularly in Europe, they focus on the implementation problem. But here, this is an example, in my opinion, that even if the implementation is a bit improved, still you don't achieve the result. So there must be something else. It's not only a question of implementation. let's go on the regulatory trend. As you know, the deregulatory trend has been started in parallel with the regulatory trend, normally later, but often they're working in parallel. And the idea is that we should streamline, simplify, and reduce environmental legislation. And this is the key word in all jurisdictions. All the business sector is, fed up with so much environmental regulation, environmental bureaucracy. So we should streamline, simplify, get rid of the burdens of the legislation. What happens with that? That often you have a decrease in the level of environmental protection, and you don't attack the problem of how to deal with the relationship with the mainstream economic model. So you still support the mainstream economic model. So a good example of that, once again, I primarily look at European legislation. Here again, in an area where the European legislation is recognized around the world as being a paradigm, it is the most developed type of legislation in this field, on the emission trading scheme, which is regarded around the world. I've been working on that in detail together with some colleagues, linking the legal and the economic side. And normally the experts of emission trading scheme, they recognize that the European legislation is now a benchmark on this, also, taken over and considered when you have examples in North America. And, you have a few examples here. The problem is that even there, I mean, this legislation has 100% compliance in Europe. So it's perfect in terms of compliance, but still it's not achieving much, because the way it is built is in a way that is not harming business. And I know that from, having been involved in a project, talking to government officials, to business people, to academics, and they all agree that this is perfect, because, otherwise we would have taxation, we would have something that will be forcing business to change their behavior. We were very happy with ETS. It's built in a way that is not creating any problem, and it's perfect, it's working. But it's not achieving so much. It's not achieving what should be achieving in environmental terms. So there must be something wrong in the design. And so I think finally there is a failure also with both regulation and regulation. And so there are common failures, I think. So next, let's move on. And if you look at the regulatory trend in a few words, you can say there is a failure from the point of view of environmental status, and there is a failure for business, because I agree, very often I have to agree with business that there is a lot of burden, and sometimes it's unnecessary burden. It's just environmental bureaucracy, and you don't gain anything in environmental terms. On the other side, if you move towards a deregulatory trend, you have a short-term gain for business very often, but you keep on having a failure for the environment. So I think there is something wrong in both approaches, and in any case, both these approaches, they share lack of long-term vision. So we need something else. This was the starting point of my research. And so let's move on, and let's see how we can describe this, what I call the double failure of both the regulatory and deregulatory trends. Firstly, we have to understand the causes of such a double failure, and on this basis, rethink environmental law. And secondly, next, we need to promote a shift from these. When I put deregulatory in brackets, I mentioned both of them, regulatory and deregulatory. So both regimes, we have to move away from this idea that environmental law should be only focusing on managing environmental negative externalities, and we should have a new reference paradigm. The main causes of this double failure, in my opinion, refers to lack of effectiveness, and the second cause, it refers to the fact that both regulation and regulation have been based on a wrong reference object. So I was talking about the two main causes of the double failure as I identified them in my research, and then I will move on to say what is my understanding of ecological law. So briefly, the two main causes of this double failure that I was presenting earlier are the lack of effectiveness and the fact that both regulation and regulation tradition have been based on what I say, the wrong reference object. Let's have a look at that. Lack of effectiveness. Let's move on, please. Next. Lack of effectiveness, obviously, I'm trying to summarize here. I've been doing some work based on the work of Bodansky on the legal side, based on Oren Yang, so a much broader approach. You can say that there are three major understanding and meanings of legal effectiveness in the environmental sector in particular. What it can be said: legal effectiveness, behavioral effectiveness, and problem-solving effectiveness. Basically, I can say very briefly that according to the research I've been doing, the main problem is that both regulation and regulation traditionally focus on the legal effectiveness, on the formality of the effectiveness. Sometimes they look at behavioral change, but they don't really look at whether there is a proper approach towards problem solving. Usually environmental law is not conceived in a way that should really solve the problem, but should just fix the externalities. And so it's a very formalistic approach, and often this is one of the reasons that doesn't lead to a proper result in terms of improving the quality of the environment. As for the wrong reference object, as I say, this is related to the fact that both traditional environmental regulation and the regulation, they look at the protection of the environment, environmental media from negative externalities, but they don't question, next please, they don't question the support to neoclassical economic model. And if we don't tackle this issue, I think there is no hope in fine-tuning environmental law. We need something different. And that's why I argue, next please, I argue that there is a need of a change of perspective. We need to put at the center of the picture the need to preserve the health and the integrity of ecosystem as our priority. This should be a change of perspective based on a systemic paradigm shift along the lines of what famous studies by Kuhn says, what is a systemic paradigm shift. And of course, I will not go in detail with that. So I use the concept of ecological sustainability that was mentioned by Klaus in the previous talk, and is borrowed mostly by the work of Staffan Westerlund from Sweden. I think this is a very convincing way of describing what we aim to. Of course, there might be, of course, I'm aware there might be different words and different ways of describing that. But more or less, we are talking about how to promote sustainable patterns of human development in harmony with nature. So moving on to saying something more about the meaning of the concept. It can be defined, in my opinion, as the need for human civilization to live in harmony with nature and preserve the ecosystem which enable life on the planet Earth and support human development. And you can also talk about foundations of life. You can use other words, but more or less this is the idea. And I think that it's important that we recognize, in my opinion, ecological sustainability as a non-negotiable prerequisite for economic and social development. So, in my opinion, we shouldn't be satisfied with the traditional three pillars approach of sustainable development, but the ecological sustainability should be the basis for human development, socio-economic development. So it's another way of designing that. It might be a different way, but this should be the basis for development. And here, of course, please, you can, the ecological sustainability can be described, I've been doing that in some papers along three elements. So the content, very briefly, might be said to looking at protecting and preserving the health and the integrity of ecosystem for true kind of sustainable development. Personally, I will not have time to expand on that. I think we shouldn't be throwing away the word sustainable development. I know that many legal scholars are completely, tired of talking about sustainable development, but I think, and I will be, maybe I will expound on that tomorrow when I present ELGA, I think there is a political momentum now with the SDGs, although I'm not 100% happy with the understanding of SDGs that there is around the world, but I think there is a window of opportunity, so we shouldn't now get rid of the word sustainable development and try to give a proper understanding of that. As a legal status, ecological sustainability might be a principle. This is a very legal, technical discussion. I will not go in detail about that. There is, a lot of literature about that. So it can be a startup pointed to a certain direction. It can have several functions related to enabling, directing, interpretive, and balancing functions. Can be used in policy making, can be used by courts and tribunals. So let's move on. So another problem is, why do I like ecological law? I don't know if this is a real issue in North America. In Europe, is a serious issue because ecological law is quite a new concept. So people are not really, many people are not ready to embrace this terminological shift, this change of language from environmental law to ecological law. One of the reasons why I'm convinced that ecological law might be the right catchword is that it changes the perspective. So the environment is something that is around humans. Humans are not part of it, at least as many people perceive the word. If we talk about ecological law next, we can talk about ecosystems, and we as humans are protecting each ecosystem, and we are part of it. So we are protecting humans along with the other living beings and other foundations of life. So I think this change of perspective is very important. And that's why I prefer to talk about ecological law, because humans are part of it. So this, we can get a bit rid of this traditional distinction between anthropocentric, ecocentric approach, and have something like a blended approach, which I think is useful if we want to have a new start. That's why I like the word ecological law. And so let's move on. This name shift should signal, in my opinion, a corresponding radical change in the underpinning value. We should start thinking, moving away from the human dominance over nature to the human responsibility towards nature, and from the exploitation of natural resources to the duty of humanity to respect and protect nature, including all living and non-living forms present on the planet, for mutual benefit and an enduring common flourishing. I have to say I didn't put a reference on that, but all the time I talked about that. I think I have to encourage people to read the encyclical letter of Pope Francis. Irrespective, I always say to my students, irrespective of your religion, of your religious belief, this is a good reading, particularly as a starting point, because it links clearly this with policymaking, and it's a very well written way of departing from this idea of humans have a sort of, let's say, almost an obligation of dominance over nature, and moving away from that and moving towards a responsibility towards nature. So I think it's really worth reading that, even if you can skip there is a couple of religious chapters. I would say to my students, skip that if you don't, but read the rest, because it's a very easy reading, and it gives you the different perspective. And so finally, as a concluding word, a tentative agenda. That's what we have been trying to do in Siena, and we are probably trying to do here. In my opinion, we need to have a different paradigm. In my opinion, ecological sustainability is a good word. There might be other ways of describing that. It's important that we agree on what we want to do. We should promote the shift in the new terminology. In my opinion, from environmental law to ecological law is a good way of describing that. I was using this catchword from environmental law to ecological law well before you put it as the title of the conference, so I'm very happy about that. And as to the reassessment and revision of the law on this, I mean, we could have a discussion. I think it's more a question of changing the paradigm than a question of changing the laws. We will need to change some laws, but most of all, we need to change the attitude towards environmental law. So I very much like what, for example, Klaus Bosseman describes as ecological approaches to environmental law. He just edited a book compiling several articles on that. I think it's more a question of changing the approach. I mean, all over the world, for example, I always make this example, we have environmental impact assessment procedures. They are in place now in all jurisdictions around the world. There, you don't need to change very much in the letter of the law. You just need to change the approach. If you have an ecological law approach and you consider the protection of foundational life is your priority, then you can use the law that is there and use the procedure that is there and have a completely different results. So it's not a question of, completely changing the law. It's more a question of having a different approach. And this is, let's say, forcing academics to have a dialogue with policymakers, with the civil society, with judges. Many jurisdiction judges are ready to understand better. So we have a common responsibility as academics about that. And I think this is an important message we have to give. Okay, I think it's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to
here, and we'll try now, though, to hold the 5 minutes of comments. Carol?
Thank you. Thank you, Massimiliano. Very interesting. Great. I agree with you on the importance or the interest of the books of biblical advocacy, but to me, it really reads also as a degrowth manifesto. And so I want to just ask you about I noticed you also did not focus a lot on growth per se, and to me, the way I define ecological law is essentially an approach to law that seeks to constrain economic activity, constrain growth, at least in the short term. So,
yeah, this is a very tricky issue. I mean, I know many of you have been involved on degrowth a lot. I mean, in Europe, actually, it's very hard to talk about degrowth. I mean, it's really, it's really not accepted as a term by many people. So actually, I'm very sympathetic to degrowth, I have to say. I mean, we had also Latouche in Siena a few times, and we have been this. Actually, he says that he would prefer a growth, rather than degrowth. But I think that we can, certainly we have to question the growth mania, as Herman Daly, I think, used to say, the growth mania. This is the problem. I mean, everything is based, if you look at the political debate, it's all about growth. So I think we have to get rid and produce a shift on that. I think we can have sound human socioeconomic development based on a good sound basis. So I think it's more important probably now to look at different ways of production and consumption. And that's why, for example, in the SDGs, there is a lot of stuff that is wrong or might be wrong in the implementation, but there is an SDG about changing model of consumption and production. I think this is a good window of opportunity to work there and try to promote an ecological law approach. I think we have to become more pragmatic in a sense. And I think a degrowth approach might come into the agenda without having necessarily the clash of words. I would actually prefer to get rid probably of both growth and degrowth, and start again from sound concept of development based on a sound, ecological basis. This would probably help not to get stuck in these two prejudicial debates that we experience, for example, in Europe. People supporting growth, people supporting degrowth, they don't talk to each other, they clash. Very often they might agree in practice on certain things, but they will never talk to each other. I'm not sympathetic to this kind of clashes. I think it's much more pragmatic to try and find a common ground for work. For the same reason, I think we should try to, I'm more sympathetic to an ecocentric approach than to an anthropocentric approach. But as I said earlier, even there, I think we should probably try to have a blended approach, and try to be more pragmatic. And probably the same is my opinion on growth versus degrowth. I would probably try to get rid of both and start afresh with a better understanding of development.
There were other.
There's a question online from Kate. Maybe she can jump in. So her question was, what do you think are several effective methods to accomplish the paradigm shift you mentioned?
So methods what does she mean by that?
Effective might be the key word.
To make it effective, you mean? I think this is, yes, of course. I mean, we are in a phase where I think actually we need to find methods and examples. This is actually what I think. This is a limit of the research as I see it so far. I think it's clear in my mind what is the paradigm shift. Now we need to do work. And I think personally, I haven't started to go too much in the detail. And I think this is what we need. I mean, we need to have some example and some best practices we need to show. One of the aim of this association we started is to facilitate exchange of best practices and of experiences in different jurisdictions, because very often when you want to change and make a shift in terms of ecological law or even rights of nature, there are similar situations where people have a good idea in a local context, but they feel isolated. They feel the burden is too big. That's why we need to import best practices, start looking at local practices and try to bring them in other jurisdictions and reproduce them. And I think there is a lot of work to do. I don't have, easy recipes yet, but I think it's, if we agree on what we need to do, then, we can have in a few years good example and put them together and show that this is a feasible alternative. It's just a theoretical idea.
Adhering to the 5-minute rule, the last question is Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, and it's really encouraging to hear about a big shift in the way we think about things along the lines you were suggesting. So as a kind of a mean-spirited ecological economist, I'll ask you what I think is a tough one. So what would law look like if it was connected to physics and to the laws of thermodynamics? Because you didn't mention any, every time something is developed, something is undeveloped somewhere else, right? Even if it's on the sun, right? There's no sort of free lunch in any of this. So how would you, does law have to be connected basically to an understanding of energy material flows in order to make the shift you're suggesting?
Yes, I'm completely on this side. I think the second law of thermodynamics is essential for this analysis. When I initially started working on that, I've been working with economists most in recent years, but I've been working with scientists sometimes. And I remember very well when I first had a speech talking about the second law of thermodynamics and law at the legal audience, they didn't understand what I was talking about. So I quite tend not to work on that in my presentation, but I completely agree on that. I think this is essential. It's essential that law has a clear connection. I mean, it's based on the second law of thermodynamics, it's based on a certain economic underpinning, and then law can be effective. It's very much related to the place of law, because many lawyers around the world, they perceive themselves as in the traditional way, in the sense that when do you need lawyers? You need lawyers when there is the implementation of the law. You don't need lawyers in the lawmaking process. This is what is my experience. I'm always quarreling with my colleagues, saying, oh, actually, lawyers are needed in the lawmaking process, and they should talk to scientists and to economists. But this is a question of how the law schools are structured, how is the law education structured. If lawyers become aware that they might have a say in this process, this will change very much the effectiveness of what law can do. But the price of that is that lawyers in this area need to become open to interdisciplinarity, open to dialogue, which is not an easy task. So, but I think I'm perfectly on this direction. And
well, one sentence that education in the laws of in the entropy laws, what happens to your car when you lend it to your teenage son, right? That's entropy. Right?
Thank you all very much.